reality is no longer limited to countercultural militias, but it's a major political force in our society, and it's adhered to by a lot of veterans and active duty service members in the mainstream. There are different ways that veterans respond to war. As I illustrated, many of us come home and are forced to deal with an anti-war perspective. The guilt and self-hatred that grow out of being the perpetrator of violence is a significant part of what comprises veteran suffering today. But this is hidden by the highly medicalized discourse of PTSD. I'll say more about that in a minute. The other way that this gets dealt with is that self-identified warriors end up dealing with their pain by deciding that they are a fundamentally different kind of person, a warrior, and that we warriors operate according to different ethical standards than the rest of the civilian populace. Concerning PTSD, what happened with the PTSD diagnosis that I just described is actually a very good example of medicalization, which we talked about back in our medical anthropology unit. I mentioned that medicalization is what happens when something that was previously considered to be a social phenomena gets transposed into the realm of the medical. The Nancy Shepherd Hughes reading that I assigned you was very critical of this process, claiming that physicians and medical discourse are not adequate for addressing many of the issues that get medicalized. In some cases, the medical discourse actually erases some forms of truth. The PTSD diagnosis is actually exemplary of this. You can take a social phenomena, war atrocities, and the participation in them creates problems. That's the social phenomena. The process of medicalization takes that experience and it reduces it to a medical diagnosis that's treatable through medical and pharmacological therapy, and the problem is attributed to biological, amoral causes. Not only does this not properly heal the suffering subject, in this case we're talking about the veteran, but it also erases the moral dilemma of the situation itself, and it erases the countless unnamed civilians who are the most numerous victims of war. Our society is able to acknowledge that PTSD exists and is a problem, but it has a much harder time dealing with moral dilemmas. One could imagine, like if we look at what's going on in the world right now, if our society decided that it was going to acknowledge the pain and suffering of hyper-policed communities of color, but decided that it was going to do so by turning that, trying to name that suffering as some sort of disease that might be treatable with a drug, doing so would erase a lot of the pertinent social context from that suffering. And it might prioritize the suffering of some people over others in trying to understand what that is. And I'm speculating here, but as a scholar of American culture and a war veteran, I wouldn't be surprised if our society approached that situation by prioritizing not the suffering of the people who live in the communities of color, but the suffering of the police officers who patrol those communities. And that's not to say that that suffering isn't real, but it's to say that the process of medicalization filters social realities through a kind of lens that renders some things visible and other things less visible, and tells us how we're supposed to understand them. This is what medicalization does, and it's why medical anthropologists are so concerned with it. So back to militarism. I named that article "The Wounds That Never Heal" because at that time I felt like the kind of suffering that I was talking about there was something that categorically could not be gotten over. My more recent work does not really view it that way. However, much like Nancy Shepherd Hughes suggested, I've found that addressing this problem in a meaningful way can be better accomplished through avenues outside of biomedicine and outside of Western philosophical paradigms. And I'm going to move on And trying to keep it short, I'm going to tie in the reading about applied anthropology now, and because there's not as, I think it's going to be a little easier to understand, and I don't think we need to take a whole video for that. Applied anthropology is something that is not defined by its theoretical apparatus, but rather applied anthropology speaks to the work done by anthropologists who are dedicated to using anthropology to solve tangible problems. If we recall our lesson on medical anthropology when we were talking about clinical versus critical medical anthropology, the clinical medical anthropology was an example of applied anthropology. The anthropologists who are working in that capacity are trying to address something material. If you recall the joke that Nancy Shepherd Hughes made where the physician and the three anthropologists were trying to address the issue of drowning people floating down the river, two of the three anthropologists walked away to do theoretical work, while one of them, in this case it was Arthur Kleinman, went to try to facilitate the relationship between the doctor and the patient. This was a joke and it was kind of mocking that position, but it does represent somewhat the work of an applied anthropologist. The applied anthropologist's job is not to produce knowledge for intellectual use as the priority, but they're working in a very direct way to try and address the matter that they're concerned with. I assigned you a reading by Paul Farmer. Paul Farmer is someone you may have heard of. He's a very well-known anthropologist. He's a medical anthropologist, a graduate of Duke University, and he's also a physician. He has an MD. He's worked for many years in Haiti, and he's the founder of the organization Partners in Health. And he's very directly involved in working on issues related to poverty and health, and is an advisor to the Inspector General of the United Nations. And I'm not going to spend as much time on this. Like I said, it's not because it's less important, but it's because I think the concept is going to be an easy one for you to understand. I won't go into a lot of detail about the reading, but I'm going to quote Farmer. Since a physician must have access to medicines and supplies in order to work on behalf of the victims of human rights violations thus defined, you would think that physicians would be deeply involved in pressing for social and economic rights. And since anthropologists often work in settings of violence and privation, you would think that anthropologists might have contributed heavily to our understanding of the dynamics of human rights violations. To date, however, human rights scholarship has largely been the province of lawyers and juridical experts. Reports and documentation have been more likely to come from church groups and non-governmental organizations than from academics. With a few notable exceptions, many of them cited in these pages, physicians and anthropologists have had far too little to say about human rights. But, as a physician to the poor, I have seen what has happened and what continues to happen to those whose rights and freedoms, particularly freedom from want, are not safeguarded. As an anthropologist, I can discern the outlines of many of the ideologies used to conceal or even justify assaults on human dignity. So in this chapter, Farmer begins to talk about structural violence, which is a term that I'd like for you to know. Structural violence is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It might not manifest in the classic forms of violence, like people being attacked with weapons, but the result is largely the same. These are the kinds of violence that are generated by power structures, things that are often invisible to some people. An example of this in U.S. society is, of course, structural racism. To people who experience this, it is very clear how social structures reinforce suffering in racialized communities, often in very complex ways. However, structural racism remains so invisible to some people that a large segment of U.S. society denies that it even exists. Farmer quotes Orrin Starn, who we read earlier this semester regarding writing culture. Starn published a controversial essay 30 years ago. Starn works in Peru, and he noticed that even anthropologists, and note that he was referring to something that was happening during and prior to the 1980s and was part of what Ortner's Dark Anthropology essay referred to as culturalist anthropology. Starr noticed that anthropologists of Peru, where he worked, did a lot to describe the goodness and the color and the culture of